Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The United States, and I would say the UK and Europe, are living through a pivotal decade. We are still experiencing the aftermath of the Great Recession. There's a reason it was called great. We still have to grow 8.3 million jobs to make up the jobs we lost during the downturn and to keep pace with population and labor dynamics. But more importantly, we need to grow better jobs because we saw a quantum leap in the number of people living in poverty and near poverty in the last decade, from 81 million in 2000 to 107 million in 2011. Now, in theory, when you have these kind of great challenges, you have to think about restructuring, quote unquote, your growth model from an economy pre-recession that was characterized by consumption and debt, and in the United States, home building and steroids and financial engineering, to an economy essentially fueled by innovation, not just idea generation, but production, technology-led growth, powered by low carbon advanced energy, driven by exports and foreign investment and global engagement. Now, also in theory, you might need a national government to help set a platform for that restructuring. We have a minor problem in the United States. Our federal government has essentially, like Elvis, left the building. And there are times when we're not sure it's coming back. But we have another structural shift in the US, which I think may play itself out in similar ways here and in Europe, which is because of the aging of our society. What our national government actually does is beginning to change. Over the next 10 years, the US federal government will spend about $1.2 to $1.5 trillion more a year on Medicare and Medicaid. That's our healthcare spending, and Social Security, our retirement benefits. And so what that will begin to do is squeeze down investments, crowd out investments in some minor things like defense and infrastructure and research and development and housing. And within a relatively short period of time, about 52% of what our federal government does is just going to be healthcare and retirement. So in some ways, the national government in the US is becoming a very large health insurance company with an army. And essentially, it's sending a signal to everyone else in our system, not just city and metropolitan elected leaders or governors, but to the broader network of institutions and leaders that co-produce our economy and co-govern our communities. You're now in charge, right, of really setting the destiny for your places and making these economy-shaping, place-making investments. So that brings us to the revolution. What we see happening across the United States in the absence of federal leadership are cities and metropolitan areas stepping up and doing the hard work to grow jobs and grow a more productive, innovative, sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economy. Now, they're doing that because they can. We have 388 metropolitan areas in the United States. A quarter of them sit on an eighth of our land mass. They're 2/3 of our population. They're 3/4 of our GDP. And on every single indicator that powers a modern, sophisticated economy, whether it's skilled workers, whether it's infrastructure to move people, goods, energy, services, ideas, or whether it's innovation, however we measure innovation, there's 75, 80, 85, 90% of the national share. For all intents and purposes, there is no American economy. What we are is a network of metropolitan economies. And to some extent, the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil is because these places are urbanizing and industrializing. They're becoming more like us. In the aftermath of the recession, what city and metropolitan leaders are doing is changing their growth model. Post-recession, we have to get back to fundamentals, right? What drives what? Here are the stories in our book. Denver and Los Angeles using local resources to finance state-of-the-art modern transit, not just to move people through congested metros, but also to send a signal to the world. We're going to be a sustainable metropolis in the 21st century and an attractive place for innovative firms and talented workers. Northeast Ohio, philanthropy and business coming together to support a network of small and medium-sized manufacturing firms, the recognition we still make things in the United States and we export those things, and they're helping small firms toughen up their business plans, retool their facilities, retrain their workers, and prepare their products for global markets. In New York, I'll go into this with a little more detail, but a radical shift in 1 decade from a growth model where they wanted to subsidize 2 sports stadia on the west side of Manhattan to compete for the 2012 Olympics, to a growth model where they're attracting world-beating engineering universities like Cornell and Technion to Roosevelt Island. Portland, a very weird and crunchy metropolitan area, right, where the hippies went in the United States, but an export powerhouse. One of the few cities and metros to double exports in the middle part of the last decade, and now with a targeted strategy to export to Asia and Latin America sustainable products and sustainable services, which Portland is very, very good at. And Houston, one of the most demographically diverse cities and metros in the United States, setting up a network of settlement houses to help integrate literally thousands of immigrants every year, giving them access to low-cost banking, English as a second language, charter schools, skills, healthcare. And finally, Detroit. And everyone knows the story of Detroit, 138 square miles, went from about 1.9 million in population in 1950 down to less than 700,000 today. In many parts of Detroit, a wasteland, tens of thousands of abandoned buildings. But in the heart of Detroit, the downtown, the riverfront, Canada actually sits to the south, up the old storied Woodward corridor to the Midtown, where you have Wayne State University and Henry Ford Health System, Detroit Medical Campus. Detroit is reviving from its core. Only 3% of its landmass, 40% of its population, but billions of corporate and civic investment happening in a city where essentially the local government doesn't even exist. So let's go to New York. And this is a story essentially of the depths of the recession, where Bloomberg and his team crowdsourced the idea of how to diversify an economy that was too dependent on financial services. What they've been able to do is attract a series of institutions, large-scale advanced research institutions, Cornell and Technion to Roosevelt Island, but they've also been working with other homegrown advanced universities on urban science, data science, and engineering. Look at the math of this. About 130 million of the city's capital budget put it to do, basically redo infrastructure to prepare for these advanced research institutions. $2 billion in private capital already raised to do the construction. Estimated about $30 billion over 30 years in private capital, 50,000 jobs, 1,000 startups. This is the kind of smart, strategic economic development that large cities and metropolitan areas need to follow than the consumption Starbucks and Stadia model that basically captured the pre-recession era. So the old notion, you want to grow an innovative, productive, resilient economy, go get an advanced research institution, wait 50 years and see what happens. Actually, I think the life cycle has been shortened to 3 or 5 or 7 years. New York City is now becoming a tech center, just like London is becoming a tech center. And the introduction of Cornell and Technion in our system, this is going to take this up to a whole nother level. Think about what this might mean for London. So how do you start a revolution? At least one that's peaceful. First, you create a network, right? It's critical to understand that when we talk about cities in the United States or when we talk about metropolitan areas, we are not talking about governments. The federal government is a government. States are governments. Whitehall is a government. Cities and metros are networks. That's why they're so powerful. So what's really critical is to create and steward networks. In New York City, that really was Bloomberg crowdsourcing the applied science idea with his team. In Northeast Ohio, the manufacturing story, it's really a network of networks and institutions. There's a fund for an economic future that's philanthropy-backed. There are cluster intermediaries dealing with bioscience, dealing with the retooling of the auto sector. And there are other institutions working with small and medium-sized manufacturers to give them access to private capital. In Detroit, it really is a loose affiliation of millionaires and billionaires, right? Different kinds of networks coming together all around this notion of let's revive from the core, and I'll talk about that a little more as we go. Second, you need a vision. In the pre-recession economy, we all had the sense that the consumption economy was ubiquitous. A Walmart in Phoenix or Pittsburgh is the same as a Walmart in Denver or Detroit. You know, same footprint, same prices, same design. That's why they're so profitable. But the traded economy, the productive economy, the innovative economy is differentiated. You know, what Phoenix trades is different from what Pittsburgh trades, and what makes Denver a global metropolis is different from what makes Detroit a global metropolis. So what's happening in the United States is city leaders are beginning to follow the maxim of the great 20th century philosopher Dolly Parton. You know, find out who you are and do it on purpose. So in New York, they looked at who they are, and they were not happy. Too much dependence on financial services, too little STEM in their system, science, technology, engineering, math. In Portland, they looked at themselves and said, hey, we're an export powerhouse. And not only that, we're at the vanguard of the clean industrial revolution, clean tech. We can export sustainable products and services to Asia and to Latin America. And then Detroit, in this sort of great landmass of despair, right? They looked at their core, only 3% of the landmass, and said, we've got unbelievable assets here. And if we could basically invest, primarily corporate civic, we can unlock more private capital, grow jobs, grow a tax base. Final piece is find your game changer. If you went around US cities or metropolitan areas in the United States today and say, in the last 50 years, what was the major intervention that put you on a different economic trajectory, changed your profile, changed your performance? Many cities could answer that question. It's when we tore down a freeway along the waterfront and put in transit, as Portland did. It's when we attracted a world-beating advanced research university like the University of Washington to Seattle back in the mid part of the last century to serve not just Washington State, but the whole Northwest. These transformative interventions, these game changers, really do change economic trajectory. New York, Northeast Ohio, Detroit, they're all game-changing initiatives around innovation. New York is about an institutional platform for innovation, this applied research, applied sciences. Northeast Ohio is the recognition that manufacturing is innovative, right? For a long time in the US, and I would say here, we thought about manufacturing as like the old dirty industry. Well, what are cars? They're computers on wheels, right? I mean, these are the most technologically sophisticated sectors of our economy, 90% of our patents. A country that doesn't make things will cease to be innovative over time. And finally, Detroit, the recognition that there's a different spatial geography of innovation in the 21st century. 15 years ago, if you wanted to find the innovation zones, go to a downtown, get in a car, drive 30 miles to a science park, and then you're basically in this sterile environment of closed corporate campuses, you know, the notion of protect your secrets, don't talk to anyone else, and at the end of the day, just get back in your car and drive the 30 miles back to the city. Well, that's not what's happening today. People want to be in lively, vibrant, walkable, livable, bikeable, connected places, and firms want to be close to other firms, right? So you have that synergistic effect of a bump and mingle kind of environment. So as we go forward over the next several years, whether Washington does something incredibly brilliant or incredibly stupid, right? I think what really is going to happen in the United States is cities and metropolitan areas are really going to find their game changers and are going to find their way to leverage public, private, civic capital, but also expertise that is customized and aligned to their assets and their attributes and advantages. And here's really where we may end up.
From an early age, we are taught how our nation is supposed to work. The president, vice president, and members of Congress sit at the top. Governors and legislators run their states. The rest of us take our cues from them. While states and the federal government may be part of the Constitution, our population and economic power is actually concentrated in our metropolitan areas. It's time to rethink power in America. In this century, metros will lead, and states and the federal government will follow. In cities and metros, public, private, and civic leaders are helping workers get the skills they need, investing in infrastructure and growing jobs through expanded trade and investment, the hard work necessary to renew our economy.
The health and vitality of a nation as great as the United States is not dependent on 537 elected officials in Washington, D.C. You know, our power really grows from our cities and our metropolitan areas that are the engines of our economy and the centers of our trade and investment, and on the front lines of demographic transformation and environmental change. And in this century, I think they will be the vanguard of policy innovation and social progress.
On this issue of spatial geography,
right.
After years of experimentation, decades of experimentation with regional government and these kinds of things, there now seems to be a genuine bottom-up movement by local authorities in England to reorganise themselves into more relevant units. So we have in Greater Manchester, Manchester and the surrounding authorities becoming a legal entity
right.
and working together rather than the suburbs and the centre competing. And we have moves towards combined authorities, Leeds, Sheffield, North East, places that have always been kind of, you know, at war with each other, very right. kind of parochial, seeing, as I say, the cities and suburbs in conflict. Now, that's one of the themes of your
Absolutely.
book, that these successful places that you described, part of the success was an alliance between city and suburb, which often had to cross party affiliations.
That's right. So I think the most interesting story from this perspective in the book is the story of Denver, because, you know, Denver's about 2 million people in essentially the middle of nowhere. It doesn't have a advanced research institution. It was an extractive economy for a long period of time. And basically the cities and suburbs were at war with each other over the typical stuff that cities and suburbs are at war in the United States: school integration, racial division, et cetera. They finally, in the 70s, city and county leaders, business and civic leaders said, you know, we just have to collaborate to compete. This is ridiculous. I mean, we're going to be a flyover metro unless we get our act together. So they began doing the easy stuff. They didn't really combine into one authority, but they began to collaborate around arts and culture financing. And then they began to make their way over the tougher stuff, which is ultimately building a state-of-the-art 118-mile light rail system, not just to move people around, but to really change development patterns so Denver can, greater Denver, can become this much more livable, sustainable place. And what we're seeing around the US is this kind of voluntary alignment of cities and suburbs and corporate and civic. I think what's going on in Manchester, I'm going there on Friday, is really quite remarkable, and I think is the kind of, you know, organic bottom-up collaboration, but also the recognition that the real unit of the economy is the metropolis, the commuter shed, the labor market, the housing market, not artificial political borders.
In reality, we are a long way away from the division that you've described. There are so many things that are different here. We don't have many mayors. We have centralization of the administration of public services. We have very limited powers to raise money locally. We have very circumscribed powers around spending money locally. So if you were, and I wish you were, but if you were in charge of a strategy for devolution in England, what would you say were the essential elements? Is it raising money locally? Is it more freedom how to spend it? Is it mayors? What are the critical things that we need to do? And you've read the Heseltine report, presumably, so you know what his thoughts are.
Absolutely. Well, I thought the Heseltine report was brilliant, frankly. I would have just said, okay, let's just get on with it. But I think at the central level, you want to make some platform-setting investments in innovation, in infrastructure like high-speed rail, in skills, so that you can begin to align the potential for the reshoring of production. I mean,
But that means letting cities take risks.
Absolutely, and that means there will be failures. And I think that the US will probably more tolerant, both in the private and the public realms of failure. But it's this notion of experimentation, continuous innovation, and a circuitry of innovation where you reward people for taking risks when it goes well. So this tax devolution, this revenue raising, is really essential, because when you do smart things, you should be able to keep the rewards as opposed to bundling up the revenues, sending them back to Whitehall to distribute to the rest of the country. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You also want to have a circuitry of innovation that is horizontal rather than vertical. I mean, look at bike sharing. I mean, and how that sort of just blows through cities across the country, or the High Line, and every city now thinking about how to recapture these rail beds, you know, for new purposes. Cities observe each other, they replicate, they adapt and tailor faster. It's almost like a market mechanism than central governments or state governments. So, you know, I think there needs to be devolution across multiple levels here not just around tax-raising powers or revenue-raising powers, but also flexibility of funding. I would say at the end of the day, probably the most important thing is cultural, or actually rather than more than programmatic, is how do you have people, whether they're elected, whether they're appointed, whether they're in these different sectors, how do we begin to inculcate sort of pragmatic, affirmative risk-taking that is evidence-driven, strategy-driven, held accountable? That's the kind of behavioral change you want to have in a country. It won't come from a program. In the United States, it comes more from philanthropy, basically giving people the ability to take risk, fail, get up and do it again, right? And so it's hard for government to do this. But at the end of the day, I think this is a radically different century than the 20th century. And we need to understand that is how countries succeed, how they thrive, how they prosper, really will depend on unleashing the latent power of their cities and metropolitan areas.